Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this evening's Concord Museum Forum with Harold Holzer. I know I'm a new face for many of you, and I'll quickly just introduce myself before I introduce our illustrious speaker. I'm Lisa Krasner, the new Edward W. Kane Executive Director, and I joined the museum on September 1 after nearly 25 years working at the Museum of Fine Arts Boston, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and the American Museum of Natural History. So I'm thrilled to be part of the Concord Museum and to further its vital mission. So this Concord Museum Forum series is key to our mission to educate visitors about the history of Concord and its contributing influence on American political, literary, and cultural life. In conjunction with this week's opening of our new special exhibition, the Lincoln Memorial Illustrated, we're delighted to have Harold Holzer with us tonight. Harold is a preeminent Abraham Lincoln scholar who has written numerous books on Lincoln and the Civil War era. He has also won numerous awards for his work, including the National Humanities Medal in 2008 and the Gilder Lehrman Lincoln Prize in 2015. So Harold is an extremely prolific writer, and one would think that is all that he does, but that is not the case. He's currently the director of the Roosevelt House Public Policy Institute at Hunter College, and prior to that, Harold was the senior vice president for public affairs at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, where for a few years we crossed paths, and I had the good fortune to call him a colleague. So in light of the Lincoln Memorial Illustrated exhibition, which was a collaboration between the Norman Rockwell Museum and Chesterwood and opens at the museum on Friday, we're honored to have Harold with us tonight to discuss Monument Man, the life and art of Daniel Chester French. It is a beautiful and detailed biography of French from his early years here in Concord and the journey that led to his most famous sculpture, the Lincoln Memorial. Tonight, Harold has prepared a presentation with some stunning images from the book and the exhibition at the museum. While Harold is presenting, we encourage you to send any questions in the chat. I will come back on the screen at the end of the program to relay those questions to Harold. I hope you enjoy the program, and I'll now turn it over to Harold. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Lisa. Thanks for inviting me. I'm sorry I couldn't make it in person as was the plan. I threw my back out at LaGuardia Airport over the weekend, and I'm afraid I was almost immovable for a couple of days. Happy to be sitting up and happy to be speaking to you. And what a special treat it is to join in the welcome of Lisa Krasner, who is again, our paths crossed but briefly in the life of the Met, where people have been known to stay for half a century. But we got a couple of years in the same museum, and she was a wonderful colleague and an innovator and hard worker, and I'm sure she will be a great asset to the Concord Museum. Anyway, I'm thrilled to be speaking to you about one of your favorite sons. There are many in Concord, of course, Daniel Chester French, the sculptor who, as Lisa said, created the Lincoln Memorial, and the Lincoln Memorial is the impetus for the new exhibition that came from the Rockwell Museum. Let's begin with Dan in his dotage, painted here in Stockbridge, Massachusetts, in front of a model for the Lincoln Memorial. And where did it all start? Well, this, believe it or not, is Dan. Those of us who have also lost our hair may not have pictures quite like this, but pictures with hair. This is Dan as a little boy smiling, which is a pretty rare expression in early photography, supposedly captivated by a bird that the photographer had as a prop to make little children, young sitters, sit still or stand still in this case. Dan became a lifelong ornithology fan and spent many years as a teenager in Concord, chasing birds, collecting birds, and actually using that knowledge later to become a kind of a master at creating wings for his sculptures. But in Concord, he had the teacher at left, the man in the middle is John Quincy Adams Ward, who became an important influence later. But that woman at the left is Concord's own May Alcott. As you all know, I'm sure, the model for Amy in Little Women. French's father was a lawyer and judge, and wanted Dan very much to be a professional. Sent him to MIT as a young man. He commuted from the Concord train, but Dan got terrible grades at MIT, dropped out after a single semester, and but was sculpting at home, whether it was out of snow or bark or clay. And his father took him to May Alcott, who was the art teacher in residence in Concord, and said, "Does my boy have any talent?" And May said he did, gave him his first sculpting tools, and launched his career really as a professional. And that career began modestly with Parian pieces like these spooning owls, which are, rather mundane, but which were enormously popular. Dan sold over the rights for something like $50 and was always angry in later years whenever he walked by a shop in New York or London or Boston and saw them on sale. He always would say to whoever he was with, "I sold these for too little." I should add at this point that when I was researching my book, I had the wonderful opportunity to visit the Concord Museum, not only the fabulous DCF collection on public view, but some of the back rooms with French's props and tools. And it was a great experience that I think informed my appreciation of his formative years. And here is Dan as a young man, 23 years old, 24 years old. I still got his hair, as you see. And he gets the commission of a lifetime, much less an initial commission. And that is, of course, to do the great Concord sculpture of the Minuteman. And it was an astonishing success. The President of the United States was in attendance. Emerson wrote his great poem to celebrate the achievement, and Dan, became instantaneously famous. Some critics got his name wrong, but the sculpture was widely reproduced, and of course Dan fiddled with it and made reductions for years. This is a beauty of a reduction that was once I believe, on the prow of a ship. And here it is, direct from your museum, an absolutely gorgeous rendition of the Minuteman. Well, you'd think that Dan would have allowed himself to enjoy that triumph in 1875, but he was actually here in Florence, studying in the studio of Hiram Powers at the left, and on the right, someone who would be quite influential in his career for several reasons, and that's Thomas Ball, the sculptor on our right. And Ball had just finished the now controversial Emancipation Monument in Washington, D.C. I have no doubt that Dan got his first exposure to Lincoln sculpture in Ball's studio in Florence, because this model was definitely in the Florence studio at the time. So he quickly adopts a bohemian air for his Italian sojourn. Most of the work he does is on small commissions, but he studies in Ball's fabulous atelier and produces one classical style piece called The Awakening of Endymion, from which experience I think he learned that was not his strength. The retelling of myth would not be his forte. This sculpture actually wound up in a garden somewhere in either Concord, I think maybe Concord, or Stockbridge, Massachusetts. And it had to be rescued from oblivion. It was just not saleable, and he always regretted that he didn't sell it. Well, he returns in 1877 or 8, looking like this, a rather dapper young man nearing the age of 30. And when his ship pulls into Boston, he is astonished to see the mail packet, MAIL packet, skimming up to the side of his transatlantic ship. And someone getting off, and an announcement is made: "Will Daniel Chester French please report below decks to the mail packet?" Those are the ships that arrived at big ships and took the US mail in from foreign ports. Anyway, French was wondering why his name was called. The answer to the question was that his father was on board. here is a sculpture, a bust he did of his father, Judge French. Judge French had just been nominated as Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, under whose terms he had access to this ship. He took Dan back to Concord, to Boston, and he said, well, young man, I'm paraphrasing, you've got to make a choice now. Are you going to stay here in Concord or go with the family to Washington? Because that's where we're going. So Dan went to Washington and worked there at a studio near the White House for several years, producing works for hire like this, called Labor, Sustaining Art, and the Family. And basically, these were works designed for the pediments of public buildings that guess who was supervising? Yes, his father. And his father gave him the jobs. Dan, I guess, was grateful, but also resentful that he was only getting per diem wages in these early days. He clearly needs another great idea, as great as the Minuteman idea. And he develops it right back at his home in Concord, doing a life portrait of Ralph Waldo Emerson. And here is the great man in French's original bust. Emerson loved it. He said, that's what I see in the mirror when I shave. And French had it reproduced, and he was back on the fast track to sculptural fame. Well, sculptors in those days like to find specialties, fields that they could dominate. And Dan's chosen field at this early stage, for some reason, was college presidents. While in Washington, he had met the Gallaudet family, and he did a sculpture of that teacher of the hearing impaired. You see the model in Dan's new studio in Greenwich Village in New York City. And here is the sculpture on campus today. Still a very compelling bronze of Gallaudet and one of his early pupils. Of course, also John Harvard now in Harvard Yard, but originally in front of Memorial Hall, as those who are familiar with the campus will recognize. And then alma mater for Columbia University. Injured twice, once by a ball hit by star baseball player Lou Gehrig. The ball didn't quite hit the statue, but it hit the base. Those days when the stadium was on the main campus are long gone. And later, of course, struck by a bomb in 1969, allegedly set by the weathermen during that period of campus unrest. It was gilded at the time, and now the gilding has been removed, and it still reigns over the Low Library on the main campus. Another early specialty, and many Northern sculptors developed this one, and that, of course, is Civil War heroes. And no, Dan never did a Confederate monument. I mean, he was a worker for hire for big pay, but he did Ulysses S. Grant for Fairmount Park in Philadelphia, and General Hooker for the State House in Boston. And the dedication was probably the first gigantic dedication of his own work that French attended. And this is the ceremony that day in Boston. And of course, anyone in Concord will be familiar with the Melvin Memorial, a tribute by the surviving brother of that family. The others had died during the Civil War. And this, of course, installed in the cemetery in Concord, quite gorgeous, and known now colloquially as Morning Victory, an absolute sensation and a tour de force as sculpture. You see the diaphanous gown on the figure of Columbia carrying her laurel wreath. It's just three-dimensional, really two-dimensional, but a real tour de force. And then for the cemetery in Boston, death stays the hand of the sculptor. And this a tribute to his competitor, Martin Milmore, who died young. And here the Angel of Death, winged Angel of Death. And those are wings that Dan sent to his ornithologist friend to get some new bird wings to model. This is the marble version of that Boston sculpture that's in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And progressive fame, he's the sculptor of choice for the World Columbian Exposition in Chicago in 1893, does this massive figure of the Republic, bigger than the Statue of Liberty and definitely meant to compete with it. But like all the fugitive material works of art for the World's Fair, it burned to the ground. There is a copy, and it's going to be situated and I think become familiar again, because it is a gilded copy that sits in front of what will become the Barack Obama Presidential Library in Chicago. By then, French buys a farmhouse in the Berkshires, has Henry Bacon, his architect of choice from his days at the World's Fair, design this gorgeous home, Chesterwood, and a studio nearby, adjacent to it really. And there does his first work in his new country home, an equestrian of George Washington that is unveiled in Paris in 1901 in front of the Guimet Museum, for all of you who have visited the Asian Art Museum in Paris. And a major, major ceremony again. In those days, American statues in Europe are usually welcomed with John Philip Sousa music. This music was played by John Philip Sousa, so it was quite an event. Back in New York City, his winter home, he sculpts a group for the front of the new U.S. Custom House. This is his model for America, and this is how that continent looks today in front of the building, and sleeping Africa. Perhaps a cliche even then, certainly now, and it is the one French sculpture that's in dispute today and that some wish to have removed because it's kind of deemed offensive to people of color and of African descent. We shall see. In its day, the four sculptures were widely received, and the Custom House was important because in the days before the income tax, most of the federal revenue in this country was raised in that very building. So Dan, at last welcomed into the world of hair loss, is now the distinguished sculptor of a good 30 years experience. Now, for almost all of those 30 years, there has been interest in building a Lincoln Memorial. In fact, Clark Mills, who made a life cast of Lincoln's face shortly before the president's death, had proposed this kind of wedding cake memorial for the front of the Capitol. It was never built, it was never funded, but it was out there to remind people of the potential. Augustus St. Gaudens might have been the likeliest to get the commission. This is his great statue in Chicago, and they were friends and competitors. When General Sherman died in New York City, St. Gaudens was asked to make a death mask, and he felt, I don't know, what do the kids say, creeped out about doing a death mask. So he asked Daniel French to go with him, and it was French who made this death mask, although Sherman then took possession of it and used it for his great work outside the Plaza Hotel in Central Park. Dan begins experimenting with Lincolns. Now he's already got, this is his Lincoln, complete with a forelock that some of Lincoln's living contemporaries thought was not quite appropriate, but he stuck with it. And he got a commission that was kind of a starter Lincoln project for Lincoln, Nebraska. This brooding, standing Lincoln in front of a slab designed by Henry Bacon, emblazoned with the words of the Gettysburg Address, and it is still there in front of the state capitol of Nebraska. Well, who would finally get the ball rolling in Washington? It was up to the National Commission of Fine Arts. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, well, 8 white men and a white male secretary, as you see standing behind taking notes. And the chairman is the man in the middle, Daniel Chester French. A slight conflict of interest, but he's used to that. Think of the Minuteman Commission, no competition. Emerson and his father sort of chose him. And now again, he's going to choose himself. St. Gaudens is dead, but he's got to work it out so it looks appropriate. Meanwhile, the bigwigs in Washington are battling about where to build the memorial. It was not always designed for that spot on the edge of the National Mall where it sits today. In fact, there was thought of building it near the train terminal. This is the Amtrak terminal in Washington, looking quite different than it does today, surrounded by federal buildings. No, they said commuters would rush to and from their trains and not pay sufficient attention to Lincoln. By now, funding is finally being allocated by the Republican-controlled House and Senate. And with Theodore Roosevelt and William Howard Taft, Republicans in the White House, big Lincoln admirers, it is finally going to happen 40 plus years after Lincoln's death. Another suggestion, the front of the Capitol, the spot now occupied by a Grant statue. The soldiers' home outside of Washington, where Lincoln spent his summers, in that house on the left. The Naval Observatory, where Lincoln enjoyed looking at the stars through telescopes, or a spot on the north part of town called Meridian Park. But Meridian Park already had a seated statue of Lincoln's predecessor, the unsuccessful James Buchanan. Finally, a decision was advanced, or a proposal was advanced, to build it in the swampy marshlands on the banks of the Potomac, which looked like this. And a very powerful congressman named Joe Cannon from Illinois, who had actually seen Lincoln in his younger days, said, "I'll be damned if I'm going to let a statue of my hero be built in that blank, blank swamp." He said, "Before I let that happen, I will put it in Arlington, across the river in Virginia." Obviously, the irony lost on him that that was the home of a slaveholder. Perhaps thinking that it was possible, Henry Bacon, who was chosen without a competition to be the architect, makes his first design look a little bit like Arlington. Those of you who have climbed the steps of the Lincoln Memorial breathlessly may wonder what it might have been like to climb the steps of Bacon's initial conception, which you see here. Well, Bacon was malleable. He also thought of this kind of Lincoln Memorial. And for Egyptologists, he had a pyramid with a classical facade. And for the Mayan and Aztec influence, this stepped pyramid style. He was ready to do this project, whatever the final design. And here is Bacon at this time. And here, the famous familiar design that ultimately was embraced. But originally, there was a great deal of thought given to saving money by having Augustus St. Gaudens' statue reproduced. French really opposed that. Naturally, he wanted it to be his statue. He went so far as to design a standing Lincoln in case that was the choice of the commission. Now French resigns from the commission, but accepts the job. He didn't even want to leave the National Commission of Fine Arts, and argues successfully, it must be a seated Lincoln in this hallowed spot, because it must be visible from the bottom step as well as the top. And a standing Lincoln, the face of a standing Lincoln might not be visible from the ground level. A very wise and practical observation. So now French goes to work, both in New York and the Berkshires. He studies photographs of Lincoln, including this famous seated photograph, which I think was a great influence for him. He studies Lincoln's life mask, which he inserted those nails himself to take measurements. Casts of Lincoln's hands made when Lincoln was nominated for the presidency back in 1860. And then French's own hands are cast in the manner in which he wants to sculpt them. And by 1915, he creates what he calls a model based on my first enthusiasms. This is 1915. years before, 7 years before the memorial itself is dedicated, how close he was to the final conception. An enthroned Lincoln, informal yet majestic. And as he told Henry Bacon, I'm feeling very encouraged. Come up and see it. And obviously, great enthusiasm. This is the 3-foot model completed in 1916, now looking very much like the final. And then a 7-foot model with Dan posing right next to it, with the original model tucked into under Lincoln's coat there on the bottom. Now, French says, for all intents and purposes, it's an accomplished fact. It's as good as I can make it. And then he goes down to visit the building in progress. And to his horror, he realizes that the atrium is just too massive for the 12-foot statue that had been commissioned and funded by the government. He says, no, it has to be 19 feet. And they say, we can't afford it. So he makes a head proportionate to a 19-foot statue, brings it to Washington, has it suspended from the ceiling, calls the leaders of Congress and the Lincoln Memorial Commission to look, and they agree. Yes, it must be the bigger statue. They give him a bigger commission, and he goes on to send his model to a group of Italian stonecutters in the Bronx, right near what is now Yankee Stadium, and using 6,000 cubic feet of Georgia marble. The Piccirilli brothers go to work carving. French goes up there periodically, usually around lunchtime, because one of the brothers is always assigned to making a pasta lunch, and French enjoys it. And here you see the actual carving. I found this in a magazine article after my book came out. I will always regret that these illustrations did not make it into the book. And here's another sketch from the Piccirilli studio. Meanwhile, the memorial itself is taking shape on the swamp, slowly coming to form. Look at that huge basement that will soon be landscaped out of the picture and will someday be open to the public. It's being reconditioned now as a museum, which will be quite amazing. It's almost as deep as the building is tall, so it's quite a remarkable architectural feat. And here the final, as it looks in around 1920, after which 28 pieces of marble, 21 of them carved, are delivered in 1919 to Washington on special railroad lines and assembled for the first time in the building. French had never seen it put together. That's one of the Piccirilli brothers hovering in front of it. But by November 19th, here are French on the left and Henry Bacon. It is done. And French has used those two ladders. He's 69 years old, and he scampered up and done the finishing touches, burnished out the seams, and it is really ready for dedication. That doesn't happen for 2.5 years. It's 100 years ago today, which is, I think, the compelling reason for the new exhibition, that thousands gather at the memorial for the extraordinary dedication. Two presidents of the United States, Warren Harding on the left and former President Taft, now the Chief Justice, are in attendance. Sitting in the corner next to the pillar with his hand on his stomach or chest is Robert Lincoln, the president's only surviving son. One African-American speaker, Robert Russell Moulton, but the Harding administration and Justice Taft demanded that he submit his speech in advance and basically told him he could not use some of the words that he had drafted, saying that America had yet to complete its unfinished work on race. He could either accept the censorship or not, or give up his speaking slot. So his speech remained unpublished and unspoken for generations. Taft said it was propagandistic, and Moulton had to accede. Black citizens who came and sat in those front row and, up front chairs early that day were rousted out of their seats by the Capitol Police and moved to a segregated section right near the reflecting pool on benches without backs. While the white press of the United States raved about the statue, the black press did complain bitterly that it was not a dedication in keeping with a man who had been known in his day and really ever since up to that point as a great emancipator. It was a white man's event. President Harding, Robert Lincoln, and Uncle Joe Cannon, the former Speaker of the House, two of whom had seen Lincoln in the flesh, as I mentioned. And here it is with that great epigraph written by an art critic of the New York Tribune, by the way. In this temple, as in the hearts of the people for whom he saved the Union, the memory of Abraham Lincoln is enshrined forever. The only early problem was the lighting. The skylight had been waxed over during French's long vacation leading up to the dedication. And he got General Electric to study and then fund the kind of lighting that we are used to today. It's much improved since then. But really, from 1922 to 1939, it remained a statue marred by that early dedication ceremony. All that changed on Easter Sunday, 1939, when Marian Anderson sang her great concert arranged by Eleanor Roosevelt. She had been denied access to the Daughters of the American Revolution. And so the concert was moved to the Lincoln Memorial, where she sang live on the radio as well. Still available on YouTube if you'd like to hear an extraordinary series of songs by this great American singer. And that same year, 1939, the Lincoln Memorial is immortalized through a visit by Jimmy Stewart in Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, and by the ending of Abe Lincoln in Illinois. Suddenly, the Lincoln Memorial has been changed. It's now not just a tribute to Lincoln, but an object of aspiration, of protest even. Witness this 1946 meeting of the NAACP. Attended, you see, speaking is Harry Truman, the president, and sitting in the front row, second from the right, Eleanor Roosevelt, who had arranged for Marian Anderson. And then just skip to 1963. Of course, August 28th, the day of Dr. King's great speech after the March on Washington. And there you see America's great civil rights leaders posing in front of the Lincoln Memorial. Dr. King, second from the right in the front row. And that handsome young man, third from the left on the top row, is John Lewis, future Congressman John Lewis. On that great day, Dr. King began the speech. We all know the I Have a Dream part, but began the speech with a reference to the Lincoln Memorial. 50 years ago, a great American in whose majestic shadow we stand today signed the Emancipation Proclamation, a joyous daybreak to end the long night of captivity. But 100 years later, the Negro still is not free. And thus began perhaps the most famous speech of the 20th century in front of this extraordinary place. Well, it also becomes the place where American presidents spend their last evenings before their inauguration. That's a really quite a wonderful tradition. Here is George Herbert Walker Bush, the day before his swearing in, the Clintons and Gores in 1993. President Bush in 2001. All three of them big Lincoln admirers, by the way. This is, I'm told, Barack Obama's favorite election day photograph. It was not the photograph of himself in Lincoln Park in Chicago. It was a photograph of a bunch of people who spontaneously went to the Lincoln Memorial and stayed all night until news of his election was broadcast to the country. And then President Obama himself in 2009. 2016, the Trumps. and the quiet and kind of eerie appearance with no audience of Joe Biden on January 19th, 2021. He'd gone through a lot by then, as had the country. Well, there are a lot of responses to the Lincoln Memorial that are now classics unto themselves, and some of them are in view in this wonderful new exhibition. Bill Malden's 1963 cartoon of the memorial weeping at the news of the death of Kennedy. Jeff Dancy's cartoon celebrating a fist bump to celebrate the election of the first Black president. News of the Trump election. This is one of my favorites, not just because I lent it to the exhibition, but it's by Matt Davies of Newsday. Peter Brooks's cartoon of Lincoln turning off his television after watching the first Trump-Biden debate. And then Drew Sheneman celebrating the safe inauguration of the president and in 2021. And continuing as a symbol. This is one of the recent ones. His message in brief. What did Lincoln say? What does the memorial represent? The argument here is it represents Black Lives Matter. This is by David Horsey of the Los Angeles Times. By the way, quite a change from the image of Lincoln on the mall in his own time. This is an 1862 cartoon that suggests that Lincoln, when he removes his mask, is the devil himself. And you see on the unfinished Washington Monument in back of him, we're almost on the Lincoln Memorial steps, or what would become the steps. There is a gallows set up to give him his just punishment. But we live in an age when Lincoln statues, sadly, in my view, are coming down. This is a statue of Lincoln toppled in Portland in 2020 to protest Lincoln's treatment of Native peoples in Minnesota. And during the Black Lives Matter protests, this fake image was widely circulated on the internet to suggest that the protesters had desecrated the Lincoln Memorial. Totally untrue. The Lincoln Memorial continues to be a symbol in and out of Washington. This is a statue that won a competition for best beachfront sand sculpture a couple of summers ago. Pretty impressive considering the material. And here is a Norman Rockwell, which is in the show, a print of the Lincoln Memorial by Rockwell, and a rather handsome one, I think. This is another of my loans to the show. I'm very proud of this one because it was painted. It's a watercolor of Lincoln angered by the results of the 2000 election. And the painter is Tony Bennett. Yes, that Tony Bennett, who is not only a singer, but a painter. I just want to show you a series of photographs now. This is the Lincoln Memorial during this long period of lockdown. When my friend Brian Lamb, who is the founder of C-SPAN, as many of you know, walked around the Lincoln Memorial almost every day of the lockdown for exercise and for reflection. And these are some of the pictures that he took. They're amusing, they're heartwarming. Here's a recent one with another aspirational event about to happen. Yet another. And finally, we get back to the man of the hour, Daniel Chester French, creator of the Lincoln Memorial. As he looked toward the end of his life, whatever he was working on, his Lincoln model remains in the background. Because just as the final version, the behemoth, inspires us, the model continued to inspire him to the end of his day. In fact, he was photographed here on one of his very last visits. And he said to his driver, "I wish I could live for 1,000 years because I'd love to come back and see this memorial then." Will it stand? Will sculptures stand? And that's one of the one of the important subjects that implicitly the new exhibition addresses in this age of iconoclasm and evolving reputations of Lincoln and many other white leaders of America who had their flaws but also made enormous contributions to the country and the culture. What is their fate? I want to end this part of the presentation with yet another drawing. This is Bob Stocky's iconic cover for the New Yorker after Barack Obama's election in 2008. And of course, it suggests the connection between Lincoln, the emancipator, and Obama, the first African-American president. But it also fits into my final thoughts because it shows the Lincoln Memorial at night. I don't think there's a sculpture in America that is more beautiful, more mystical almost after dark than the Lincoln Memorial. And many of its 5 million annual visitors, in fact, visit to see the illuminated statue at night. One of those who did so early was a young hotel porter who was about to leave for his college education. He was a resident of Washington, and he was about to go south to a historically Black college, and he went to the Lincoln Memorial. His name was Langston Hughes, and obviously he etched a great career as a poet. But this is what he wrote in 1926 on one of those evening visits to the Lincoln Memorial. And I'd like to close with his words and then invite your questions, which I would be happy to answer. This is Langston Hughes, 1926. Let's go see old Abe, sitting lonely in the marble and the moonlight. Quiet for 10,000 centuries, old Abe. Quiet for a million years. Quiet and yet a voice forever. A voice against the timeless walls of time. Old Abe. Thank you for the chance to virtually visit the exhibition again. I hope all of you online go to see it and celebrate the connection between Rockwell and Lincoln and drawing and sculpture and cartooning. And of course, to mark the 100th anniversary of the Lincoln Memorial, and not coincidentally, because I'm told the show will last through the new year, the 160th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Harold. That was an impressive. It was really wonderful to hear from you, and your depth of knowledge on the subject is really wonderful.
Thanks.
So we have a few questions that came in. Someone asked if you could tell us a bit more about French's partnership with Bacon. Did they work on other projects together? What was their working relationship like?
So yes, they did. They worked on the Great Fountain in Saratoga. They worked on the Nebraska project. Originally started working in Chicago. The Lincoln Memorial was their greatest project, but also they worked on the Farragut Memorial in Washington, which is a rather impressionistic rendering of the memory of the Civil War's great admiral. Sort of the sea, the wind, the air. It's quite beautiful. And so they continued to collaborate through the years. Their relationship was interesting. I don't think French ever yielded his belief that he was the senior partner, even though, and of course he was the senior guy, even though Bacon was, in a sense, the man who commissioned him, his mentor, his friend, to do the Lincoln Memorial. Bacon was very much the junior in, who's got the approval of what. But I think they had a fabulous relationship. French was very heartbroken when Bacon died young, and mourned the loss of a friend as well as a collaborator.
Another question that came in, what was French's favorite work of all his works? Did he have a favorite?
That's an interesting question.
Yeah.
I think he was like most creative people in that he liked what he was working on at the time, at the time anyone asked. Of course, he knew that his reputation was going to be most firmly secured and last longest because of the Lincoln Memorial. So you see in his interviews that that he refers almost shrugs at the notion that he could be remembered for anything else. But no, I think he liked the nudes that he did, even though they weren't celebrated. And he was working on a female nude at the time of his death and just sort of was unable to complete it. I think he liked the alma mater. He liked the Gallaudet. He didn't like criticism. What else is new? I'll tell you an interesting story about which alludes to the other relationship that I talked about, the tense one with St. Gaudens. They were really close to being contemporaries, but there again, St. Gaudens assumed the role of senior. He had a big country estate first. St. Gaudens visited and said, "Oh, this is how I want to live." So it was always that kind of a relationship. I'm doing the death mask of Sherman. Come on over and actually put the plaster on the dead guy's face because you're my junior. You can act as my assistant on this occasion. But French was about to get married in Washington in the spring. I forgot the year, but he was marrying Mary French, his first cousin, but we'll leave that out of the story for now. And he had just finished the Gallaudet statue. And St. Gaudens said to him, the feet are not quite right. This drove French crazy. He actually postponed his wedding, reconfigured the feet. And as Mary French later said, as a result, I had the enormous privilege of getting married in Washington, D.C. in the hottest day of the year in the summer. So another tense relationship. I think the Lincoln Memorial must have ranked as his favorite because he knew what a reputation builder it was.
Right. But it would, 1,000 years from now, we'd still be talking.
Yeah.
Someone else, tell us about his production methods. He was productive and prolific. Who helped with production?
That's a really great question. And I'm always asked that question, usually from a more negative point of view. But the easiest way to get to this subject is to say, French did not operate the way Michelangelo operated. He did not have a slab of marble that he chipped away at, out of which emerged David. That was not the way it was done in his day or in St. Gaudens' day. He worked on clay models, and then he had assistants in the studio, either in New York City or in Chesterwood, who would make plaster copies. French would then make enlargements, and again, studio assistants. And then at a certain point, he would turn over the final plaster model. If it was a full-size plaster model, he would turn it over to a foundry to be made into a bronze, or he would turn it over to his marble cutters of choice, those once forgotten Piccirilli brothers of the Bronx, who were 10th generation Italian born stone cutters. And they just were remarkable. They made precise enlarged copies of French's work. And that was the final work. So in a sense, it was a production line process based on an original concept and model made by French himself. And of course, as he got older and more successful, he had more help. He had a favorite woman assistant to carve the letters on the two Lincoln speeches that are incised on the walls of the Lincoln Memorial. He had studio assistants to do, embellishments, the decor he wanted. So that was the way the most successful sculptors of the day work. But I don't think that means we should call the Lincoln Memorial from the studio of Daniel Chester French. I think it's still from the hand of Daniel Chester French. And he made sure that he did the final work on all of the work, on all of his marbles and all of the publicly installed statues. I mean, for the George Washington, he was up on ladders in Paris just before July 4th, the date of its dedication. And on the Lincoln Memorial as an old fellow, although, you know, now I'm looking at his, to be 69 years old again, that would be great. But he was limber enough to go up there and do the final burnishing. So very much a collaborative process and a very good question. I'm glad someone asked.
So some Concord questions. Somebody asked about the French house in Concord is on the National Register, but along those lines, why did French choose to be buried in Sleepy Hollow instead of one of the other places he lived? And what was really special about his time in Concord?
Well, it was a formative time. It was a time he met and knew Emerson. Concord was his academy, being a college dropout. It's where he absorbed the culture of the time, the reverence for beauty and creativity. It was the home of his parents, and he was very, very close to his parents and very close to his stepmother as well. They were a very happy family of sisters, and he sculpted them. And each spot, I mean, he designated the Concord Free Library for his seated Emerson, and he did the Millmore Memorial for Sleepy Hollow. And I think he wanted to be in the kind of almost the shadow of the Minuteman, but literally in the same cemetery as that gorgeous Morning Victory sculpture in Sleepy Hollow. I just think he loved the town. And, you know, he built his first studio there, the first studio that he designed from scratch. And although he, you know, abandoned it for the big city at some point, and then ultimately for Stockbridge, which is easier to commute to from New York City, I think he always loved that building. And on my last visit to Concord, I was shocked and thrilled that the museum held a reception in that studio because someone lives there now. So it's still lovingly used by a fan of Daniel Chester French, who showed me, this is the wall that was here. This is the wall that we added it. Not they, but subsequent owners. So he felt that association deeply. And of course, one still feels it going to your museum, most of all.
Concordians are very loyal. So, someone asked, can you say something about Meadowlark across the street from Chesterwood and his second studio?
Yes. Well, I stayed there to do some research. I'm sort of a scholar in residence there. So French had this glorious studio built by Henry Bacon, but it was also a visitor receiving area. And it was a place where he welcomed clients. He designed the patio outside, the benches. And I think it became too busy for him in a certain way. It also had a great innovation that he used, a railroad track that allowed him to push the base of his work outdoors so he could see it in the light. But he decided he needed more privacy. So he built another studio across the road, which had it had the advantage of privacy. And by then he was sculpting a lot of female nudes, nude models. And maybe he wanted to get away from his wife and his daughter, which is possible. His daughter was using the other studio as a party spot, as a party location. So in this new studio, he had the same idea, the same railroad track, but a much steeper grade. And French always wanted to see what a sculpture would look like on a pedestal. So he had the opportunity at Meadowlark to step down a hill and have the chance to get the perspective of what a work would look like on a high pedestal. So it just became a getaway place for him. There's a wonderful story of one of his models who came to visit him late in his life when he was working at Meadowlark and said, I've written a memoir. And French kind of flinched. That's the last thing he needed was one of his models to write a memoir. She handed him the book and said, "Aren't you glad that you were so good?" So he was not outed as behaving in an untoward way toward his models.
So a question for me is, I was in the exhibit today and I saw a number of works that you have loaned to the exhibition. Tell us a little bit about your collecting and how you have amassed all of these works.
Well, I was a serious Lincoln collector for 40 plus years. My wife and I started just visiting flea markets in Pennsylvania and Brimfield, Massachusetts, and we specialized in Lincoln images, prints, some sculpture, but mostly engravings and lithographs. And it sort of informed my early work on Lincoln, on the Lincoln image, and ultimately we decided to dispose of the collection as we elected to move to New York City, which we're still hoping to do permanently. We're not quite there yet, but we retained, the only things we retained were works by living artists that live, especially if living artists had presented them to me as gifts. It didn't seem quite appropriate to put them in an auction of historical works. So I kept the Tony Bennett watercolor, which you saw in the slideshow and is now in the show because it's a direct piece about the Lincoln Memorial. And I still get pieces from current sculptors and artists. And I was very taken with Matt Davies' cartoon of the Lincoln turning over in his throne at the news of the election of Donald Trump. Whatever your politics, it's a funny cartoon and it's very effectively done. And he lent it to Roosevelt House for an exhibition of cartoons that we did at my current base of operations, which is Franklin D. Roosevelt's home in New York City, the home he occupied during the period between his election in 1932 and his inauguration in March 1933. So when the exhibition was over, he said I could keep it, and that's the other one that I retained. So it's a much more limited collection now, but I still enjoy all the interpretive works by current artists for sure.
Wonderful. Well, no more questions have come in. So I want to thank you so very much. I mean, this was so informative. It was really special to see you tonight, reconnect a little bit as well.
Yeah.
And, thank you for being such a champion of the Concord Museum. And I want to invite everybody to come and see this important exhibition. It is up through, I don't have the exact date, sometime in February, I'll find it. It's on the website, and we just really, truly are excited to share all of this work and the story, with the public at this important moment. And thank you for being part of it, Harold. I hope you come back soon and see it, because I know you come
so.
pretty often.
Thank you, Lisa. It was an honor to be your first public program guest, and congratulations on your new post.
Thank
and
you.
Best of luck.
Thank you so much. Okay.
Good night.
Good night.